Okay, so I don't think the presenter and the discussant need any introduction whatsoever. Certainly, the presenter does not to say anything. I mean, even the discussant for sure. But in the in the interest of decorum, I think I should say at least a few words. Dr. Panagariya is somebody whom I actually have, and I'll say this just from a personal perspective, somebody who I've looked up to from a very, very, long time, and to now have, in some ways, somebody whom I can reach out to as a mentor is just a unique privilege. One thing there are me and my younger brother, who's also a professor at the Indian School of Business, typically don't agree on a lot of things. But one thing that we agree on is that, Dr. Panagariya is an excellent human being. And I think that's, it just says about him, not just as a scholar, but as somebody who cares so much for India. And I think some of his contributions when he was with Niti Aayog are ones that inspire, can inspire a generation. So, and of course, Praveen Krishna, we all know is a terrific scholar, and especially on trade and related issues. So we couldn't have had a better panel, to discuss on, I think, what is a very, very important issue on, growth and inequality. Just some perspective. I think in the advanced economies, the focus on inequality has become quite strong. But whether or not some of these concerns about inequality that is expressed in the advanced economies, should the same perspectives and should the same trade-offs manifest for a country like India at the stage at which it is in. For one, the growth potential in India is actually much higher. Second, the opportunity to bring down poverty in absolute numbers is also much higher. So both the opportunity and the challenge are significantly higher. So I think with those opening remarks, I'm very, very eager, as I'm sure all of you are, to hear the presenter and the discussant. So I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Panagariya. You have 40 minutes, and I will have to follow your own advice to be strict with you.
Okay, thanks. First of all, to start on inequality issue, I couldn't agree more that in a developing country, particularly at low levels of income, poverty should trump inequality. So I personally worry less about inequality, I must say, as long as I am bringing up the bottom 30-40% inequality is, to me, in the context of India, is less of a serious question. This whole question about billionaire Raj, etc., as people try to talk about to gain attention, really doesn't cut a lot of ice with me, frankly. But the context is such that inequality will come in, but only at the tail end. The bulk of the paper actually is focused on the issue of poverty. Let me also say that I'm while the chair of the session sort of tries to discipline me, I will probably have to discipline him as well as we go, because this very closely kind of ties into what we heard in the morning from him. So the temptation on his part to intervene is not going to be any less. So, and you will see Subbu. All right. So, very quickly, now, obviously when as COVID was unfolding, this issue of poverty came to the fore quite naturally, and some of it was, of course, also triggered by some of the images of the migrant workers, trying to go back from the urban regions to the rural regions to where they had come from, and those images got kind of flashed on the television and so on. So that really made it a bit dramatic that somehow these are the people who are getting very hard hit. And as it happened, actually, very early work that came out also reinforced that. And that is where I want to sort of start, which is the existing literature and its critique. So first, I want to just highlight two headlines from leading publications. CNN Online, sort of this headline saying, India's billionaires get richer while coronavirus pushes millions of vulnerable people into poverty, right? So as if this, not only pushing down those who are already on the bottom rung of the income distribution, but it also has pushed those who are already at the top further up. And it based that not, this was not a whimsical report being peddled by the CNN, but it was based on a study that was done by a university, Azim Premji University report on 2021. Around this time, also a little later, 6 months later, was a headline in The Economist, which said the COVID-19 pandemic pushes millions of Indians into poverty. This too was based on a paper by a bunch of economists, Arpit Gupta, Anup Malani, and Bartosz Woda. This is an NBR working paper. Maybe it's not published, but and these are just samples. I mean, you can, if you do Google search, you will see tons of these kinds of headlines appeared. Now, this certainly didn't go well with my own intuition, and I'll come to that, why I say so. First of all, in terms of the literature, two studies I already mentioned. There's a third one, which is by Surjit Bhalla and Bhalla Bhasin and Arvind Virmani. And this comes to the opposite conclusion, a very tiny bit of increase in poverty. You'll see that my numbers, to the extent that they can be compared to Bhalla's, to this, are closer to this. But this really looks only at poverty at the very aggregate level, national level, rural and urban combined and all. But more importantly, I think methodologically it's not very satisfying, because what it does is it takes the consumer expenditure survey of 2011-12, on which there is no controversy, everybody accepts it, it's a good survey, well done, nothing controversial, and says, well, I'm going to take this income distribution, and now I'm going to take the per capita income, per capita consumption expenditure, private consumption expenditure from the national account statistics and blow it up for the future years. So I freeze the income distribution, but blow up this per capita income. And that, of course, means that everybody's income rises by the same proportion as the per capita private consumption expenditure in the national account statistics. And then I'm going to go back and measure what happened to poverty. It's not very satisfying, only because, after all, income distribution can change. There's been a lot of controversy about this, that, that somehow, if you are not getting, how do you know that much of the income increases or consumption increases is not coming from the non-poor sections of the distribution and not hardly any from the poor, the population that is classified as poor. So there is that issue lurking. So it's not entirely satisfying. It usually, I think, doesn't do a poor job of getting to the numbers, but it is really not very satisfactory way of doing things. So the remaining two studies are by the ones that I mentioned already. And I'm going to not spend too much time on the one on Azim Premji University. I don't think it's an odds study, because it uses there is this alternative. So I should step back for a minute and say why what the problem is, because the consumption expenditure survey, the last one was done in 11-12. After that, we don't have a consumption expenditure survey. So how do we get around the problem? So one way was how Surjit Bhalla and his co-authors have done it. That these two other studies rely on a privately run survey, which is the Consumer Pyramid Household Survey, done by a private company called CMIE, Center for Monitoring Indian Economy. And both of these, studies use the same survey, but then they come to a very different set of conclusions. You shouldn't. And I personally think that, at least in the way of doing things, the Gupta, Malani, and Wada study does it in the right way. That's the conventional way that you got the full household distribution provided by the CMIE survey, and you can measure what poverty is and what inequality is. This is not how the Premji University study does. It does in a very different sort of way, and I'll not spend much time on that. I'll just go to the Gupta, Malani, and Vodai study. So this is what they do, and this is what they find. They find that both rural and urban poverty spiked during the lockdown, and then it comes down a bit gradually, but it remains elevated till the end of the period that they analyze. So it is still, where their sample ends in July 2021, the poverty level is still elevated relative to pre-COVID. And now this is true for both rural poverty as well as for urban poverty, and I'll show in a minute their graphs to you. This is a bit more credible, I would say, than Premji University report, but we, meaning the co-authors, this is a paper co-authored with Vishal Moore, have two reservations about it. One is that the large increase in rural poverty during the lockdown months and its elevated level subsequently, to us is inconsistent with the performance of agriculture, as well as the enhanced government transfers to rural poor. I will elaborate on that in a minute. Second, the CMIE survey is yet to attain the credibility of its more established counterparts, such as the Consumer Expenditure Survey and Periodic Labor Force Survey. Many of us really don't take it seriously, and certainly I never refer to any conclusions that are drawn or any estimates that are drawn out of that survey, and I'll talk about that as well shortly. But first, look at the graphs. Okay, you'll see that. So I took these pictures from the paper by Gupta, Malani, and Voda. So there are a couple of extra lines which I don't really need here. So this is for rural poverty, and the big arrows are indicating the two measures of rural poverty that they are using. One is based on consumption poverty line, and the other is based on income poverty line. And poverty rates you are reading on the right-hand side axis. The graphs, this is the graph that is going on consumption, consumption per capita that they use as the poverty line, and this one uses the income per capita. The levels are not terribly important here because ultimately, the level of poverty depends on where you fix the poverty line. So, the two lines are showing different levels of poverty. That only says that they are basically measuring poverty at different levels of per capita income or per capita expenditure. So that is not important. What is important is the movement. Both will show you that poverty comes, spikes, gradually kind of declines a little bit, again, this is around the second wave, it sort of spikes just a little bit and then declines. But you'll see that the level of poverty is still left significantly higher than where it was at before COVID hit. And whether you want to look at the other poverty line, it is the same story. That's a rural poverty, which I said, which I have said, is problematic in terms of at least what I would have expected. Is not something that others have expected. Everybody believed that, somehow there's this whole notion that whenever dislocation happens, it is the poor who have the hardest time to adjust to it, and therefore poverty must have actually gone up. I will argue in a second why it really is a wrong intuition. But urban poverty, again, you see the same essential pattern, same here, same two lines. And you'll see that it spikes very much. Then this one comes down a bit more sharply, but never goes back to the pre-COVID level. And this is till the end of July 2021. It stays at an elevated level. So that is basically the baseline with which I want to start. This is where I'm going to come back. Now, why the rise in rural poverty especially is implausible to me or to us. There was no let-up in sowing activity. If you look at even the newspaper reports, etc., we were all watching very keenly what is happening there, and there was no let-up. Sowing activity continued, and in fact, there was, soon after COVID, the sowing had gone up almost 4 to 5% over the previous year. So the general news, at least on agriculture, that was coming even in real time was good one, and that was actually met from that coincided with the final outcome, which we now know. So agriculture grew in 2019 25.5%, and remember that at the end of the year is when you're starting the next year, 2021. Which is where this is fiscal year, financial year of India, which goes from April 1 to March 31. So March 31 it ends in 2020, which is exactly the first week of COVID is already a part of that 2019-20, and a good bit of this is a paper by Poonam actually, which shows that even in that last week or 10 days when COVID hit, it had a huge impact. Negative impact on the GDP, significantly measurable impact during just in that 10-day period because of the lockdown, but not agriculture. Agriculture was doing okay, 2.1%. So on the heels of 2.1% growth in the previous year, in 1920 growth was 5.5%, and then in the following year, 2021, again it was 3.3%. This for agriculture actually is well above the trend growth. If you take the long-term growth of agriculture, it's around 3% in India. So clearly, agriculture itself, on which much of the rural economy is anchored, had done quite well. So that was one very clear reason why we shouldn't have expected a rise in poverty. Then government reacted very quickly. There is a rural employment guarantee scheme, which was quickly kind of beefed up. And these numbers tell you the story that fiscal year 18-19, $618 billion were spent on this employment guarantee scheme, which was jumped already in 1920. Now remember that it's only last 10 days of 1920 when COVID had hit. And yet you see the spike in the Narega expenditure to $717 billion. But the following year, 2021, it goes to 1.1 trillion rupees. So that was one cushion that was built up for rural population. The government also accelerated the cash transfers to farmer households under PM Kisan scheme, which is a modest sum, but in situations like this, even small sums matter, and that was 6,000 rupees per year. But much more importantly, as early as April 2020, the government had launched Prime Minister's Garib Kalyan Anna Yojana, PMGKAY, providing 5 kilogram per person per month free food grain to 75% of rural households and 50% of urban households. So this was a massive scheme. 800 million people across rural and urban areas were covered. So not only this helped the rural population, but also urban population. And PMGK was not by itself actually is on top of the usual provision of 5 kilograms per person per month of food grain. at highly subsidized prices to the same population groups under the National Food Security Act. So these 800 million people, the households of these 800 million people were getting total of 10 kg of grain per person per month. That actually is almost the per capita consumption in India, if you look at the earlier expenditure surveys, which give you the numbers on food consumption very directly. And you can look at it across the households. It doesn't vary a whole lot. Poor households are close to 10 kg, and richer households are also close to 10 kg. There's some little variation, but not a lot. So practically for food, the population was fully covered by the government program. So why should the poverty have gone up in rural areas? And that is the question we raise. Now, also, why we think CMI survey, at least at this stage, is not sufficiently right there, where I would use it, at least personally. Researchers, of course, feel free to use, because numbers are difficult to get and surveys are difficult to get, and you have to write your research papers. So you use what you got. Policy is different. Policy has to worry a bit more about the quality of the surveys and all. So here are my reservations. First of all, it has had a relatively short life and has had no known oversight by independent scholars and statisticians. Some scholars have criticized it, actually, for not being representative of the population. Third, I think, to me also, from a public policy perspective, the CEO and MD of the firm that actually produces this survey himself uses that same survey quite extensively to write very critical pieces in the media. It certainly produces some bit of discomfort on the part of a lot of the people. And I talked to the business people and all, and they generally take a very skeptical view, partly for that reason. Survey does have one very important advantage over what I'm going to use, which is the periodic labor force survey. It collects consumption data on about 115 different items. That, I think, is a strength of the survey. And that is something that PLFS, which I'm going to use, doesn't do. Okay? So, but PLFS has some other advantages. First of all, being a continuation of the employment-unemployment survey, it has had the benefit of scrutiny and oversight by scholars and statisticians over several decades. It allows us to measure poverty by social and religious groups. So it identifies, scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, etc. So it has that richness there. It collects information on a large number of related variables, such as unemployment, wages, etc. So within the survey, it allows you to do at least some more checks to see whether the surveys are reliable or not. And some of these actually already the chair of our session had in the morning shown you. And they do show fantastic consistency, both internally as well as with respect to some of the other sources, reliable sources of information. But it does have one very important weakness, which is that, unlike the consumer expenditure survey, which ended in 11-12 so far, it collects only a single number on expenditure. It doesn't collect on commodity groups or any commodities, specific commodities. It has now in the last 2 years, 2020, 21, and 21, 22 also just came out. So we'll add that later on, but we don't have it here. It has, for the last 2 years, it has identified 2 commodity groups, which, 5 commodity groups. So it's a little better now. But in the earlier 3 years, it collects data only on single number, which is total expenditure. It does ask in detail, that which expenditure, frequently used items in the last 30 days, the items in the last 12 months that are more kind of lasting items, durables, and the third is imputed value of consumption, which did not go through any market transaction. So that is important actually, because that then gets in the imputed value of the transfers being made, meaning the free food that was given. So the imputed value of that does come in here, that the number includes that. Okay, so that is what it is. But so you'll see what happens is that starting 2021, the distribution smooths out. Whereas earlier, what happens is because you are doing a single number, there is a tendency to round off the figure. So if your expenditure is 990 rupees or 900 rupees, you round it off to 1,000. So you see this bunching of the households where you get 1,000 or you get 2,000, etc. But really, it doesn't have much impact, on poverty measurement because, unless the poverty line itself coincides with the 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000, it doesn't matter because it's going to end up on one side or the other side. So bunching is there, but it is not impacting in any way the estimates that one gets. So very quickly, what do? We use this monthly household expenditure. We estimate rural and urban poverty as well as total poverty. Okay, thank you. Estimates the same on a quarterly basis. So very nice thing about this, about the PLFS is that the way the data are stacked, you can do the analysis on a quarterly basis. We also do rural and urban poverty annually by social and religious groups, estimate poverty by the major states. So for most states, the sample is large enough that it allows you to do the estimation by the states. And then we also look at inequality. So this is where I'll come at the end on inequality. Main findings, poverty levels derived from the PLFS are not comparable to, first of all, this is a very important point. Now, there's some literature already, because 1718 is when the PLFS already started putting the data. And some researchers did go in and use it to measure poverty. And then they compared it to the poverty levels that were measured by the Consumer Expenditure Survey of 11-12. And lo and behold, poverty has gone up. It is true that if you use the same poverty line, which is what you're going to use, Tendulkar poverty line, the poverty figures that we are going to get in all these PLFS surveys that I'm going to show you are higher. But the two are not comparable because sample designs are totally different. And even small tweaking, we know this actually, there's plenty of literature there, that even small tweaking of how you design the sample, how you ask the question, including things like, if you ask people, how much did you spend in these frequently consumed items in the last 30 days, versus you ask how much did you spend in the last 7 days, and then from 7 days you find what the equivalent 30 days expenditure is, that expenditure turns out to be larger than what they would say if you ask directly only 30 days. So even small tweaks like that can change the answer. And therefore, the poverty levels then that you're estimating turn out to be different. So they're not comparable at all. And I'll give you some very quick example why, what the serious problem is. But having said that, the important finding on the numbers is, contrary to Gupta, Malani, and Voda, rural poverty did not rise on an annual basis, at least in the post-COVID-19 era. On a quarterly basis, rural poverty rose only marginally in this strict lockdown quarter, just one quarter, April-June 2020. My own hunch is that even that rise in poverty is not reflecting that people were not capable of having to undertake the right amount of expenditure. It's simply that in that quarter, nobody got to spend much. And I think that's what drove the number in that. But anyway, you'll see that it's not a large increase in poverty. 2021, you come to rural poverty actually declines quite significantly. Annual urban poverty saw a modest rise in 2020-21 on an annual basis, and there is good reason why this should have happened, because most of the contact-intensive activities which got impacted, and in fact even the incidence of COVID was far more concentrated in urban areas than in rural areas. So that too actually is more intuitive than, thank you. Okay, so pattern of poverty turns out to be remarkably similar across major social and religious groups. So there's some pretty good consistency actually in the results. You will see that even when I look at the group, individual group level poverty, the results come out to be very consistent with the overall population. Patterns of poverty also correlate well with the incidence of COVID-19 across states. Roughly, I think this is a very rough statement. I shouldn't, I haven't done any correlations, etc. But at least on just by the look. On an annual basis, inequality fell during post-COVID-19 era in both rural and urban areas and in rural and urban areas combined. I think, this is consistent with Gupta and Malani and Ona, but quite contrary to what the Premji University kind of found, which intuitively I find that this is the correct result in a way. And why, they talked about billionaires getting richer is beyond me, because the sample surveys don't even cover a single billionaire. They're simply out of the sample. So this claim of billionaires getting richer is completely baseless. So overall claim of massive increase in poverty and inequality during COVID-19 are patently false. I think I want to be very strong here and put it in those strong terms. The effect was far more muted than claimed in the popular media. So non-comparability, basic point is here. What I've shown you here in this table, just look at the last column is what I'm asking you to look at. And top three surveys are the consumer expenditure surveys, and the bottom ones are the periodic labor force surveys. None of them is controversial. So all three you would see up there. Last column shows the per capita consumption expenditure in the survey as a proportion of per capita consumption shown as a proportion of per capita private consumption expenditure in the national accounts statistics. Okay, so these are two independent sources, and we are comparing the two. So sample surveys really capture only a part of what is captured at the aggregate level in the national account statistics. Now that number had more or less stabilized. Over time it has varied, but in the last three surveys done in 4, 5, 9, 10, and 11, 12, that number had stabilized to around 50%. Give and take 2 or 3%, but 50% is roughly where it had stabilized. For PLFS, look at it, it's only 30%. It's PLFS because they're asking a single number and all, and not cataloging all the commodities and so forth. So it records a lot lower expenditure related to the national account statistics. That, I think, is the source of the problem, and that is why I say it's not comparable. Don't do any comparison. So from here on, I'm not going to do any comparison. I'm going to restrict everything. Whatever I show you, the numbers, etc., will be 2017-18 to 2021. That is it. No comparison with the past. Okay. All right. So methodologically, what we do is Tendulkar poverty lines are known for. Tendulkar poverty lines we got by the state, by rural area, and by urban area. So we take those poverty lines and then use the price indices, consumer price index, which we get in rural India and urban India separately on a monthly basis. So we do both annual analysis and quarterly analysis. So for annual analysis, we do the conversion using the annual price indices, apply those to the original poverty lines in 11 and 12, and inflate then poverty lines to 17, 18, 18, 19, 19, 20, and 2021. For quarterly, we use a quarterly price data. Okay, so that's the quick rundown of the methodology. It's very standard, very simple. There is nothing fancy about it. That's the only sensible way to do it. Okay, so now what the numbers look like. So poverty nationally on an annual basis, right? So here we go. First bar. So this rural set of bars are rural, urban, and overall. The three sets of bars. Within each set, there are four, which is 17, 18, 18, 19, 19, 20, and 2021. Mind you, the survey year is different from the financial year. Survey year starts on July 1, ends on June 30. This is going to matter particularly when I come to the quarterly analysis. But even for annual one, it matters because in 1920, you are including that crucial first strict lockdown quarter. So 1920 it contains that very difficult quarter here. But what you would see is that rural poverty, the rate of decline slows down when you come to 1920. That's the third bar on the left. Okay, so if you take I'm looking you're looking at these numbers. Right, so 1718 is 43.5%, and then it declines fairly sharply within the year 37.8. But that sharpness declines. But 1920 is an year, by the way, which does have that last quarter, and you will see that things do get much worse in that last quarter when I give you the quarterly numbers. But the first 3 quarters are doing quite okay, and so the aggregate effect of that is still a small decline in poverty. Not an increase. Overall, there is a decline in poverty, and then, of course, 2020, when you see a much sharper decline in poverty. Okay, that's rural. Urban, obviously, the level of poverty, urban poverty is lower than rural poverty, and you'll see again there's a sharper decline in the first year, 1718 to 1819. Muted decline in 1920, but 2021 you see there is an increase. Now this is post. Lockdown is included in the 1920 year, but post that, still the economic activity, although it's recovering, it still is very far from its pre-COVID level, and so you do see the urban poverty seeing some rise, but not a very sharp one also. So because again, remember here also, even urban poor are getting that 5 kilogram per person per month of free food grain. So that is helping there as well. Overall, when you put it together, of course, poverty actually declines. Not a surprise, because the larger number of poor are actually in the rural areas, and in rural areas, poverty is actually continuously declining. And that is what, in spite of the fact that in 2021, urban poverty rises, you don't see a rise in overall poverty, because in rural poverty, you've gone from 36.3% all the way to 29.4%. That's a very sharp, very large decline, and that's what comes to dominate when you aggregate it over the entire population. So that's the national picture at the annual level. Now come to the quarterly level. Very quickly, what you would see is, for convenience, what I have done is to show you the increase in poverty in red. So wherever poverty actually went up is shown in red. Otherwise, poverty has not gone up. And you can see where these increases are there. All of this is in urban. It starts with the first, this is the lockdown quarter, April, June 1920, right? So it's April, June 20. This is the lockdown period. And then, of course, poverty does rise in urban areas, and it continues higher. Last quarter so it's the April, June of 21, then poverty reduction resumes. I am pretty confident that when we do numbers for 21, 22, that pattern that you observe here of the decline will probably hold up. So we'll see what those numbers look like. But otherwise, the picture, as I said, on rural poverty, you see that the rate of decline kind of so here, sorry, I should have been red. So you can see it. Remember, I said that there is one quarter in rural areas where the poverty rises. That's 36.4% here. So that should have been red. Compared to 34.9%, this is 36.4%. So that's the only quarter. But as I said, my hunch is that this was also because nobody got to spend what they would have otherwise spent. But once the lockdown was lifted, things went back to pretty close to where they should have been. Okay, quarterly. So this is the pictures. Same thing, 17, 18 is declining. So as we move in this direction, poverty is declining. And so 17, 18, 18, 19, 19, 20, 20, 21, you can see only that one quarter. This is rural poverty. So same numbers that I've shown you, but only in graphical terms. This is the urban one. This is where you can see that, 17, 18, 18, 19, 19, 20. But of course, you can see that the 1920 last quarter, bang, it goes up there, rises. But 2021 is all above. 2021 is above both 1819 and 1920, and it remains there, except that there's a slight decline that happens in this very last quarter, which is where our survey data end. Overall, again, very similar kind of picture. So this is the check I try to do with urban unemployment, right? At least for urban unemployment, what you would see is that here is the 1920, and this is where it spikes. That is the last quarter, remember, that is the April-June 20 quarter, the lockdown quarter. That's where it happens, but otherwise you come to 2021. From that level, it falls here, and it continues to largely fall. Again, there's some rise. This is the Delta wave, April-June 2021. Okay, so that's the story for the country as a whole, rural, urban, and overall. Very quickly, social groups. Here, scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, other backward castes, and other castes. Where are my red numbers? Okay, thank you. Here, 2021, urban, 2021 urban, 2021 urban. You can, this is important for India, by the way, because, when 10 years ago, when we were doing these numbers and poverty showed a very massive decline, we were always then get pushed back that, oh, yeah, but it is helping only the better off castes, and the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes are not benefiting. So then we did all the numbers. Vishal Moore and I, we did a whole very long paper, parsing data every which way that the data would allow us to do. And you'd hardly find a single group where poverty did not fall in 11, 12 relative to 4, 5, and 9, 10. So the same pattern, you see that. You can divide by social groups. You can do by religious groups. At least for the larger groups, you see the same pattern reproduced. Larger groups, by which I mean Hindus. Again, it's urban 2021, urban 2021 for Muslims. But here, at the end of the day, there is also a rise in the overall poverty for Muslims when you aggregate rural and urban. Rural poverty does fall marginally, but perhaps it's probable that there's a larger concentration of Muslim population in urban areas. I don't know that, but one can check that. Christians and Sikhs are smaller groups, so there I think you see some anomalies there. Even the poverty rising here, for example, for no obvious reason that I could think of. But Jains, again, is a similar kind of story, because here the sample is so small that we didn't think the estimates were even reasonable. Sample was not even 100 households, so we took that out. But when you take the all, it's so basic story that it's urban 2021 and rural generally all clean, except that one lockdown quarter holds. Selected states, these are largely states where you saw the greater concentration of COVID. You can see it's urban largely, that figure here in this cell, that shows the rise or here. Here, it's less robust here, but still that urban one generally continues, and rural you don't see, except in rare cases. Andhra you are seeing some, but it's very marginal. When the increase happens in rural areas, the number increases. It's not. Sorry. So states we are continuing. Kerala was another one where we had a bit of a concentration of COVID. Again, you see some reds here. Chhattisgarh was another one. Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh. Very interesting. Bihar, West Bengal, I don't know what's up there, but at least these numbers don't show increase in poverty either in rural areas or in urban areas. Rajasthan sees that. Punjab. Delhi is another one where you sort of, expected pattern doesn't seem to hold, meaning that, Delhi is urban. It did have pretty severe boots of COVID, but you see that the poverty is continuing to decline. Okay, finally the income distribution very quickly. So income distribution we measure by a Gini coefficient, which varies from 0 to 1. If income distribution is completely equal, everybody has the same income, all households have the same income, then the value is 0. If all income is given to one single household, then Gini coefficient has a value of 1. In between is 0, and between 0 and 1 is the distribution. So larger that numbers, closer that number to 1, more greater the inequality, and closer it is to zero, less the inequality. And you would see that, that's the consumer expenditure surveys. This is just for comparison I gave you, that you can see that it was pretty stable here. 0.34, 0.35, 0.35, not 3.6. The Gini coefficient had been relatively stable in the last 3 sample surveys, the consumer expenditure surveys. In PLFS, also in the first 2 years, it's not terribly off from what was observed in these expenditure surveys, but come to 1920 and 2021, you do see a significant decline in the value of the Gini coefficients, from 0.27 to 0.26, 3.5 to 3.5. I mean, this is a very marginal in urban here in 1920. But 2021, you see significant decline in the Gini coefficient, 2.61, 3.3, overall 3.1. And you can see, now we are going to look at the full distribution. I want to show you this full distribution. Look at that. So this is the rural India. So the poorest households are on the left. Horizontal axis is showing the stacking of the households, and vertical axis shows the per capita expenditure. Okay, and I'll get you to focus on what you should be looking at. This is, it's very difficult to get because the lines are so close to each other, but we can get to the basic story here. So poorer households here, richer households here. What you want to look at 2021. 2021 lies above all the 3 previous distributions. And if you can stress your eyes a little bit, you will see that proportionally it ends up being a bit higher here on this side than it lies on that side. So that tells you about the income distribution actually is getting better, that the increases in income in 2021 relative to 1920 are fewer, is less proportionately than at the bottom end. And so I'm ending very quickly. Last slide I want to show is this. I think this is really beautiful slide, because you'll see that now this is the total overall rural plus urban. Now remember that the total income distribution gets helped by the fact that not only that rural and urban inequality, each of those is declining, but also the fact that rural areas have lower income than urban areas. And so since rural distribution is getting so much better, overall inequality gets helped doubly. Okay? Internal, that's within group inequality is lower, but also between group inequality declines. And that is what is driving this. And you would see here that at the lower income ends, the overall level of expenditure is exceeding actually these prior distributions, but at the upper end, it is not. Upper end, it's, so the compression is, at the upper end, there is actual compression, whereas at the lower end, it actually rises. So it really works out beautifully in terms of income distribution and all, that poverty gets helped, inequality gets helped, although it's really the poverty which I am after, as I had said. So my time is up. I will just leave that slide on.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thanks to the organizers for including me in the program and inviting me to discuss this very nice paper. Thanks to Subbu for the very kind introduction at the start. So this is on poverty and inequality in India. Main motivation being studying essentially the trends in poverty, inequality as well around the kind of COVID-19 period. So let me just start by essentially summarizing the main findings of the paper. The first, I think, which you've heard just now, a very convincing case on essentially the non-comparability of expenditure data derived from the PLFS, the Periodic Labor Force Survey, relative to the Consumer Expenditure Survey. So as such, we don't necessarily expect different surveys to match up, But here, this has a great relevance in the context of these studies looking at inequality in the kind of COVID setting, because a number of the other studies that Professor Panagariya mentioned have essentially started with the Consumer Expenditure Survey of 2011 and then extrapolated from there, made comparisons with what you find in the Periodic Labor Force Survey to draw conclusions about whether expenditure increased, poverty increased, and so forth. And that's a strict no-no for all of the reasons that Professor Panagariya mentioned, but at least one, which I'll repeat here, which is that there's been a kind of a systematic problem in Indian surveys relative to kind of the national income accounts, which is the consumer expenditure, the expenditure of households that you see is only a fraction of what the national income accounts actually reflect. And so under CES, that number had stabilized to around 50% or so, whereas under PLFS, it's closer to 30, 31, 32%. So there's a direct kind of non-comparability issue. If expenditures have dropped in PLFS relative to CES, then that, it should not be the thing that you look to compare, and that's the paper's done an excellent job, really. And I've worked on some of these surveys myself, but it was actually a great learning experience for me too, just the details of why one should pay attention to this particular fact. And essentially, this, as far as I'm concerned, this puts the points made in the paper, put a real bullet through all of these other critiques and other papers that have been written, sometimes with alarmist conclusions about poverty trends that have done exactly the wrong thing, which is to start with one and then end up with the other and claim some level of comparability between the two. So coming to the kind of in a sense, the positive findings of the paper, what do we have here? One is on rural poverty. So actually, let me first say that the data that are being used, which is the PLFS, are especially suitable to the task at hand, because in the end, the lockdown period was not kind of an annual lockdown. It was a limited time period. The PLFS, because it's a monthly survey, allows one to focus on kind of issues month by month, quarter by quarter, as this paper actually does in its own implementation. And so what do we find? There's a marginal increase in rural poverty after COVID, but a reduction immediately thereafter, and then kind of a downward trend after that. A modest increase in urban poverty for about 4 quarters, followed by a reduction to kind of pre-COVID levels thereafter. And very reassuringly, both from a statistical perspective as well as kind of from an equity perspective, similar patterns across different social and religious groups. So on the one hand, the equity argument here is an obvious one. It's reassuring to see that poverty has not risen in kind of these backward classes, OBCs, scheduled tribes, and so forth. But statistically as well, you would otherwise worry that just by aggregating across groups, you have kind of overall data, maybe there's some important underlying trends in poverty patterns, et cetera, for different groups that you're not picking up. And it turns out reassuringly that is not something we need to worry about, and that's not the case. Inequality as well fell in the post-COVID period in both urban and rural areas. You're seeing kind of very nice data. Essentially what you have is this for this kind of table in the paper for poverty, showing you in red those periods for which, quarters for which poverty went up. You see the reds only reflected here in the urban, kind of for the urban group, nothing for rural and nothing for the overall. You see something similar here, as I just mentioned, for the different social groups, essentially an increase for the urban, but not for the overall. And then the Gini coefficients as well, reflecting kind of a reduction in the Gini, which is good news. We want to have a smaller Gini, kind of a lower inequality as a consequence. And so the overall conclusion in the paper is that COVID did not, in any systematic way, contrary to some of the more alarmist narratives out there, did not increase poverty or inequality in India. So let me start by saying that this was, for me, a very tough paper to discuss, primarily because the paper is extremely thorough, and it's a very, very robust analysis. And what I mean by that is, as I started to read the paper, at each stage I would read something and I'd say, maybe the author should have tried, this other variation or that other variation, and then I flip the page and that other variation of the analysis would be there, right? So I started by saying, oh, well, this is, annual analysis. It would have been for COVID. It would have been really nice to have the quarterly data. And of course, the quarterly data has actually been analyzed in the paper. That's exactly what is needed for the COVID shock. There's a huge sensitivity because we're dealing with real income here as opposed to nominal incomes. So the price indices are very, very important, right? And anybody that's worked with household expenditure data will attest to this fact that you need to be very careful about which price index you're going to be using to deflate expenditures. And here too, the paper starts with a certain set of price indices, and in my mind I'm thinking, well, maybe they should have used this index or some other index. I flip the page, yes, there's that other index that's also been used, and so on and so forth. So you've got consumer prices, wholesale prices, agricultural labor price indices, industrial labor price indices, monthly price indices, rural urban price indices, every possible, and Professor Panagariya didn't really quite talk about all this, but it's all in the paper, very, very robustly done. There's very little I could think of in terms of, constructive suggestions really about what it is that could be done further to explore this. All I was left with is to ask myself, how does this actually feel? Do the results actually pass the smell test or the sanity test? What does, one's own, what do casual observations indicate about this question? So one has to be very careful, let me say, about casual observations. And just for your entertainment, I want to put up this slide, which has a tweet from Rajdeep Sardesai, very famous news anchor. I think it was NDTV. I don't know where he is today, but CNN or India Today or something like that. But very famous, well-known TV anchor. And so very recently, India got a low ranking on the World Happiness Index. I can't remember who put this together, but somebody put it together. India got a low ranking. And his response to that was a positive in favor of India. And he said, what is this ranking? This is ridiculous. Come look at the group of people around me. Essentially, we're jogging on Marine Drive, and look how happy we are, okay? And so for those of you who've been to India, which is probably most of you, will know that Marine Drive is kind of a fancy, affluent, kind of posh area in Bombay City. And so he's just, it's like I'm eating cake, everybody else around me is eating cake, so we're all happy country. And so he was properly attacked by well-known journalist and writer Mrinal Pandey. I think she's the mother of Rohini Pandey, if I'm not mistaken, economist Rohini Pandey, if I'm not mistaken. And she had some very funny lines here saying, this is transliterated from Hindi, where she says, on Marine Drive, or in Marine Drive, there was a happy millionaire. His driver was very poor but also happy. His cook was poor but also happy. His nanny was poor but happy, and so on and so forth, essentially making the point that he was blinded just by his own surroundings, unable to see that people beyond his immediate circle might have been having a harder time than he was. So all of this is to say that one should be very careful about one's own observations of a society and obviously rely much more on the kind of statistical work that has been done by Professor Panagariya. But let me nevertheless say, all this caution notwithstanding, let me nevertheless say that my own casual observations, for what they're worth, I've been to India a few times since COVID and traveled around a bit, mostly in urban, a little bit in rural areas as well. But there really isn't that kind of, there's no discernible effect, no lasting effects of poverty, at least that I'm able to see. Maybe I'm subject to the Pandey critique of Sardesai as well, but I think not. So let me say that. Taking this method of casual observation to the next higher level of rigor, and I see some of my friends laughing here already, the next higher level of casual empiricism, popularized recently by Professor Kaushik Basu, and those of you who follow his Twitter account probably will relate well to what it is that I'm saying. It's just conversations, talking to your taxi driver, talking to your Uber driver, which I did as well, as he did. But I think it is very clear. I think when you talk to people, that's what I do in Bombay, drive around in Ubers, and individual anecdotes. I mean, obviously there were individual, personal difficulties that people faced, but these individual anecdotes aside, nobody describes COVID as a significant driver of poverty, right? It's just not part of the narrative, and just say this here, totally to the contrary, at least in my limited experience. There's a very different sense already, these are already old questions at some level. There's a very different new sense of dynamism, optimism. In the country, this idea that COVID could have had very, very large negative effects on poverty, etc. It's not what one sees, it's not what one feels. Okay, so two observations, and in many ways these have already been anticipated by Professor Panagariya, but let me say this. Obviously, in the period when COVID just hit, there was a very different consumption patterns took a shock, right? So essentially it was back to basics consumption, focus on necessities and so on. And so even if, let's even say that you saw a significant reduction in consumption data at that time, that's really not reflective of greater poverty in any way, right? So this is true for all of us. I mean, we all consume less, luxury goods of various sorts were just cut out, and so forth. So in a sense, this only strengthens the argument in the paper that, if you had actually worried about that fact as well, the argument would be even stronger that you did not see an increase in poverty. And let me just say, and this relates to the point that was made in the earlier session by Subramaniam here as well, which is that the experience in the US, in a sense, underscores this point. If you look at what happened to personal savings rates in the immediate kind of aftermath of COVID, there was a very, very rapid jump. We're talking about from personal savings went from 10% to something like 25%, right? And the Federal Reserve documents suggest that the amount of savings that were accumulated in bank deposits is something of the order of $2 to $3 trillion, right? That's how much was accumulated by middle of last year. Now it's starting to be decumulated, but nonetheless, a very large amount. So this is large increases in bank deposits that have led to all kinds of problems that we're looking at today, but that's a separate point. Here, the change in the consumption patterns itself, make you worry a little bit. When someone makes a claim that poverty's increased a lot based on the reduction in consumption, one really has to worry about this fact that maybe that's not as well being measured by that. This is a point that Professor Panagariya has made as well, and it only serves to strengthen the argument made in the paper. Separately, and perhaps relatedly, India's obviously had a very good governmental response. I'm almost done. Government response to a kind of well-targeted, fiscally conservative, very clever response, increased allocation to rural employment scheme, cash transfers to rural households, and so forth. All of these have served very well, and in a sense, brilliantly well, to smooth out income losses, et cetera, that households might have been experiencing. So let me just get to my conclusions here. First, the paper provides a very thorough analysis of poverty trends in India before and after COVID, and I think it's a very strong, hopefully final word on this topic, strongly refutes the alarmist claims regarding worsening poverty trends in India. The alignment of these trends, the broader national trends with the kind of what's going on as measured in the paper for different social, religious groups, et cetera, is reassuring, very important, both from an equity perspective as well as statistical one. And overall, I felt that the findings serve to underscore India's impressive record of economic management under COVID, which we heard a bit about in the morning as well. So congratulations to the authors on a very nice paper. I'm sorry I didn't have more substantive things to say, but that's entirely your fault for having written such a rigorous and unassailable paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Praveen. And thanks a lot, Dr. Panagariya. I'll just make one observation, and I don't have any questions, so you don't have to discipline me. I think I looked at the slide that you showed on the comparison between the CES and the PLFS. For the percentage of the consumption expenditure in these surveys that actually is, or the percentage in the national statistical surveys that is accounted for in these surveys. When you looked at, I think that's a very important slide. And what I take away from there is that about 50% of it is accounted for, consumption is accounted for in the earlier survey, and PLFS has about 30%. Now, when we come to inequality, though, the fact that there isn't that much of a difference, to me, I think that is an additional point, because, maybe I'm stating the obvious, but poverty is about the level, but the inequality is about the distribution. So even though, only 30% of the expenditure is captured in the PLFS, I think the distribution maybe, is very similar, which I think is also testimony to the survey methodology that NSSO uses, for the earlier survey and the PLFS being quite robust. So I think that's a very good, sanity check to observe. I just wanted to make that observation. Just one I think Praveen, there's a more general observation, and especially about the, about smell test and I've always felt this even when, many discussants and referees would talk about it. I think, in economics in general, we rely far too much on the smell test and, casual observation. What we have to recognize in general, that's a broader comment for, for graduate students and others to think about, is, when you think about your smell test, you're really relying on your priors. But if a paper, all it does is to reinforce your priors or basically, doesn't move your priors that much, then what's the point of that paper? I think, in some sense, the really good papers are the ones that move your priors far more. And I have, I'll mention, for instance, I mean, maybe this was in my first year as an assistant professor. I was one of the very senior professors, gives me a paper to read and said, can you take a look at the paper and tell me, some of the comments, because I want to reject the paper because it actually does not pass the smell test. It is, it doesn't fit my priors. I think in general, as a profession, we need to rely a lot less on this casual observation, and let me put it even more starkly. What's the difference between us as scholars and journalists if you basically rely on anecdotal evidence to actually, for quote unquote smell test? So I think that's a broader observation that I want to make. In general, we have to allow for papers that can shift our priors. For instance, the paper that I presented in the morning, in general would encounter more resistance. Why? Because the prior is that, how can it be the case that the US can do, so shambolically and India can do well? That's just basically pushing priors. So, but more broadly, we have to sort of think about that. With that, I think, I'm happy to open the question, the floor for questions. So let's start with this side first. Ladies first. So Nandini. There is? Is there? Yeah, okay. No, let's do that. We'll come back to you, Nandini. Blame it on me, don't, Please go ahead.
Thank you. Arvind, the journalist in me actually believes in that paper and the findings I was expecting, many of us were expecting. When I travel in India, I do see the state capacity has increased substantially. I wear my economist hat, and I have two comments. One is relating to methodology, and the second is about on policy perspective. So first, the policy thing. At that time, during COVID, one of the most affected group was migrants. Is there any way you can use your data to show either states that have that send a lot of migrants to other states, what has been the impact? Or whether you could use urban, rural, or if there's any variable in your data that says something about migration. The second question, which is about the methodology, is you have used the Tendulkar poverty line, which seems to me that it varies across states, right? So there are many papers which have used the World Bank poverty threshold, which is one constant number. My question to you to think about is, how has large-scale migration just at the time of start of COVID, how does that impact your analysis? So I'll give an example. For instance, a lot of people, migrants who were in Punjab, for instance, they moved back to Bihar and UP in Punjab. So they actually, in your sample, in your survey, they moved to their origin states. Does that impact your poverty threshold in the sense that these people moved to a place where the poverty threshold is lower? So they automatically would be above the poverty threshold. I don't know in what way the methodology affects your, I'm not questioning your general conclusion. I'm just saying that migration, generally we don't. When we think about poverty, at least in India, we don't think about migration. Can migration impact the thresholds? Can migration, but in this particular case, because we all thought that migrants were the worst affected, and there was a large-scale migration. So just around the quarters, you might actually see some impact. And would you like to actually do then the analysis by a single threshold, not the Tendulkar poverty line, but the World Bank or whatever, whatever you think is appropriate, and you think you'll get, I suppose you'll get the same answer, but it's more like, a methodology person would question this. Thank you.
Nandini?
So Arvind, is actually following up on that migration question, is there a composition effect potentially? So the PLFS survey said some 52% of urban men migrated, back to rural areas. I don't know what, you would have a better sense of these numbers. And the unemployment rate went down in urban areas and went down in rural areas. And so I wonder whether, or to what extent there's a composition effect in the sense that the migrants who are the most likely to have been affected, badly affected in urban areas, went back to rural areas, so that, had an impact on the wages in urban areas as a result. And then in the rural areas, they're getting the Narega and things, as you pointed out. So, to what extent does that affect the numbers and how we think about the poverty rates? The composition changes of who's in urban areas and who's poor there and who migrates to rural areas.
Mr. Swaminathan Iyer?
A few questions. The provision of free food clearly was a huge poverty alleviator. That has gone. Will that result in a surge in poverty? In other words, was that a particular thing which you can say is giving so much temporarily? Will we see a surge in poverty? So was that perhaps misleading in terms of a trend? Second question, I was looking at the sectional parts. The Muslim fall in poverty is dramatically less than for any other religious group. And I just wondered whether you had any views on that. Third, Bhalla Virmani have this paper showing poverty ratios fallen to less than 1% for the World Bank rate of 1.90. You have far, far higher rates. I'm just trying to explain this difference between 1% poverty rate that they're giving and about 20-odd% that you're giving.
I think maybe we've accumulated 3 questions, so you want to respond, Dr. Panagariya?
Okay, so first of all, very clear, you cannot track the actual migrants. That the survey doesn't identify, so you can't do that. But in aggregate, I suppose one can work on the numbers. That if in Bihar, let us say, the rural workforce rose quite dramatically, you can measure that, how much it rose. And one can, make the assumptions about how the population is changing, etc. But some bit of that can perhaps be captured from the surveys. Now, how good it is going to be, how well it is going to work out, I do not know. But some of this is certainly doable. I'm not worried about your, this, because you seem to be also thinking in terms of the specific migrant, that if the migrant, let's say either you can say state from Punjab to Bihar or from urban to rural, there is a different poverty line that one is using in urban. But by the way, Tendulkar poverty lines in real terms are consistent with each other. Okay? So I don't think there is that sort of problem. And so you should rightly, once they move to the rural areas, you should rightly apply the poverty line of the region in which they are. So that difference doesn't matter. Likewise, your issue of World Bank versus Tendulkar line is a non-issue. In effect, Bhalla has a long history of arguing that World Bank took the Indian poverty line and made it their own. The two are incredibly close to each other. the World Bank $90 PPP line is very close to the Tendulkar poverty line. Now, so that is the set of my answers to your question. Nandini, composition effect, again, I mean, it gets back to the same, what this means is that people who would have fallen into poverty in urban areas actually did not fall into poverty because they moved to rural areas where these safety nets were probably available or where they were taken care of by their families and so forth. I think that's the only way at least I have understood your question. But that is okay, so what? I think, in a way, that is, I'm measuring the right thing.
But is that number even accurate, about 52% of men migrating from cities to rural?
Wait a minute, who said 52%? 52% migrating?
That seems very large.
No way. No. I'll tell you. At the aggregate level, Nandini, it's very small. At the aggregate level, I mean, compared to 52. Pre-COVID, the rural workforce, the agriculture as the employer was accounting for 42.5% of the total aggregate national workforce. Post-COVID, it is about 45%, 45.5. So maximally, it's 3 percentage point. No, I think somebody is not understanding how.
There must have been a typo of some sort.
Yeah. There is some crazy stuff.
Dr. Panagariya, I just want to actually, on the lines of the argument on, or the composition effect, would it be the case that if, for instance, and because migration from, one urban area maybe to another urban area may have been, or maybe urban to rural would have been greater, so would it be reasonable to then think that if migration were accounting for results, you should not be seeing what you're seeing with the rural areas, the decline, or maybe you have to think a little bit more about this.
You're saying that there is a larger population now that has to be taken care of, but remember that they migrated to where the economy is doing quite well. Right. So the migration, I think, in the end, in terms of overall poverty, probably is helping, not hurting. Because if they had stayed in urban areas, perhaps they would have fallen below the poverty line. But the fact that they moved there, agriculture grew 5.5% in 1920, 3.3% in 2021. And then all the transfers, etc. I think that all that helped.
But just to give that point, in the extreme, if you have the migrant workers completely excluded from the survey just because they're somehow not there, right? And let's say they lost their incomes, they lost their jobs, and so they have zero income. They're somehow not the beneficiaries of the government plans in the rural areas. Then that, of course, would count as higher poverty somehow. And maybe because they're excluded from the survey, that they're just not in there. But they're not in the survey, There's not much one can do, at least using the survey, to factor that in. There's no adjustment of the survey, as far as I can tell, of the methodology that will allow you to factor that in somehow.
No, but the survey is capturing that. Migration is being captured. Yeah. Because we do see that the rural workforce has gone up from 42.5% to 45.5%. So we are capturing that. I think Swami's questions.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So quickly. So yes, Swami, I think what you say about free food now being withdrawn. Inevitably, even if poverty declines, maybe rate of decline in poverty will be less than what it would have been had the free food not been withdrawn. So unless many of the people who are receiving are already above poverty line. I mean, that's a little different.
Percentage terms, what difference did it make?
So that we can't, you'll have to do bhalla-like exercise if you're comfortable with to answer that question. I think that's the only way, that's the best you can do. He has those numbers with distribution and without distribution. Now, the levels of poverty clearly are higher among Muslims than among Hindus. I have to check, whether the decline was also much. So it's possible. So I don't know what explains that. I have no idea, because this is as far as you can go. Now, Bhallan numbers, again, Swami, it goes back to this whole issue of how much of the national account statistics you are capturing. And PLFS is capturing only 30%. And this is why those who have tried to compare PLFS numbers to the consumer expenditure survey numbers from 11-12 are saying, oh, look, poverty has gone up. But the two surveys are not comparable because that is capturing about 50% of the national account statistics expenditure. This is capturing only 30%. So even though incomes are actually rising, the fact that I'm capturing only 30% of that ends up leaving me with lower expenditure, not income, but expenditure. So it has to do with the insufficient capture of the expenditure, significantly lower capture of the expenditure in the PLFS compared with the consumer expenditure survey. Surjit is saying that, well, all of it gets captured, and so I'm going to raise the consumption expenditure in proportion to what I observe in the national account statistics.
And isn't that a general problem as well? I mean, over time, in the earlier years, it was as high as 80%, right?
Yes.
The capture of and national income accounts consumption level data through the surveys extrapolated was about 80%. All the way back.
73, this was the first one.
Yeah.
95%.
Yeah, there you go. Okay. So there's a broader problem.
So let's take the next round of questions. Rajat Gupta.
This is a somewhat broader question. I'm not an economist myself, so not econometric questions, but the COVID-19 was first and foremost a health issue and a health emergency, existential crisis. Pandemics were expected or predicted many times before first real global pandemic to hit in our recent memory, and more are expected to come. So in that sense, I guess the question I have is, how did India fare in terms of preparedness for pandemics, future, strengthening of the health system so that we can better cope with pandemics as they come along? Also in terms of poverty, health incidents are a major contributor to people going below poverty line very significantly. So all of this in the all days discussion, I've been missing a little bit the discussion on health, the state of the health of the country, and how does that impact all the discussions we are having, because without health, we are not going to make the kind of progress we're talking about.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think this is a related question, so that's why one is keen to get it in at the same time. I want to start, though, with the first comment just on these compositional issues that have been coming up throughout. They only apply when you do the separate rural-urban, but your data is also on the national level, and that, of course, addresses all those compositional issues, and you show very clearly what happens at the national level. So I don't think the compositional issues are much of a concern. The real concerns, I think, are all on the long-term consequences of this, and that relates to the health consequences. So I think across the globe, the concern more is what has happened to education. There were specific cohorts that were very hard hit, and what has happened to those cohorts. And then again, sort of relating these questions back to the Indian environment, I think what you argue, Arvind, is that the impact on COVID was less in India because these very strong safety nets kicked into place in rural areas. But I think what it also shows is that in India, the safety nets exist much more in the rural areas than in urban areas, which is why you got that migration. And that too has long-term consequences. If you have an economy which is now very well aware that rural insurance is much stronger, urban insurance is weaker, there are many more shocks, including climate shocks, health shocks coming along. This failure of policy, essentially, how does that play into the long term in addition to these concerns about health and education?
Let's take one question. Yeah, go ahead.
So Arvind, you may have already done this. So, the ratio goes down from 0.5 to 3.3, the ratio in average expenditures, the ratio to the national account. So can you adjust the Tendulkar line down by that amount to see if the poverty rates that you get are comparable to the ones that people were getting earlier from CES when that was available? And that also might actually change the trends a bit. It may or may not. I don't know which way, but it might be a way to kind of, come closer to the older poverty estimates, but also would be a good check on whether the trends are changing.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I think all the other questions really, I think we can discuss. Our next speaker is here also. So, but they really are not directly related to the paper. One thing that Anjani said, I think very, very important, which worries me, and something over which I do lose sleep. That is the fact that, in terms of transformation, we have gone the reverse direction. I mean, the whole idea is to bring the workforce out of agriculture into industry and services, and the opposite has happened. And 21-22 survey has also come in, and it has not gone back yet. It still remains at 45.5%. So that shift that happened from urban to rural areas still has not reversed itself. At least that's what the PLFS shows. So it is a huge source of worry which I share. Now the other stuff on health and all, I think that's a very broad, very big question. One will need to address it in much greater detail. Devashish, your question is actually answered in the paper. Didn't have the time to go through it. We do exactly that exercise, and of course poverty levels come down dramatically. I mean, remember that from 30% versus 50%, the moment you do a discount of 3 divided by 5 in the poverty line, what poverty levels would actually fall quite dramatically. And then I think, by 2021, by the way, Swami, I begin to get close to Surjit Bhalla's numbers. So those numbers are shown, but I don't buy those numbers myself. I don't, I show that only to make the point that, look, this is non-comparable at the end of the day. Because ultimately what, no matter how you do it, you have to make some assumption about how this uncaptured, let's say 20 percentage point of expenditure is distributed across these household groups. And what you are suggesting basically is saying that, well, it's distributed equally, so I can take that extra 20%, raise everybody by a factor of 5/3. Not very satisfactory, although we do report some of these numbers exactly doing that.
So let me just quickly, respond to Rajagupta's question. I think the larger debate, but those of you who are interested on these health, there was this chapter in the Economic Survey 2021 on healthcare titled "Healthcare Takes Center Stage Finally," where the point about increasing healthcare expenditures to 2.5% of GDP, and what is quite interesting is one of the first charts in that chapter shows that if you increase from 1% of GDP to about 2.5, it's a very convex relationship. The drop in the out-of-pocket expenditures, which leads to poverty that you talked about, is precipitous. It's very, 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 and one of the sort of, I think, disappointing aspects at the state level is that some of the rich states actually allocate less as a percentage of their state GDP to healthcare, and the point has been made in that. I think in that chapter, there's some steps that have been taken. For instance, the Ayushman Bharat, and the PMJAY program, how that has helped to reduce, some of these out-of-pocket expenditures and also improve health outcomes. But I think there's a lot more work to do on the urban versus, rural. I think one aspect that I would be watching carefully is the One Nation, One Ration Card scheme. Because compared to the rural areas, urban poor are far more vulnerable because they cannot avail the free food in the way in which the rural folks can, because of the inability to seamlessly use the ration card. Only if you are in a resident in the place you can use it. But I think with this one nation, one ration card, that might get solved, and some of the vulnerabilities of the urban poor that have hitherto existed might reduce. But I think the concern that Dr. Panagariya raised about reverse migration and into agriculture is something that, especially given how Indian agriculture has performed, is definitely a concern. So maybe we can have one more question. We started a little late, but maybe one question. But please keep it very, very short. Go ahead. The shirt with the black shirt. Yeah.
Thank you. So we've been seeing there are a lot of fears about a K-shaped recovery. Like, does this paper put all of those to bed? That's the first one. And second one is, like, the government has stopped releasing unemployment figures since 2016. So do you think that these numbers that we have would be far off from historical evidence that we have based on the government unemployment reports that they used to release from 2010 to 2016?
So 2010 to 2016 we have nothing. 2012 to 2016. But for the recent years we got 2017-18 onwards. Annually we are doing it, and for urban areas quarterly we are doing this. Same survey, PLFS, which I have used, has very detailed information on employment, unemployment, workforce, labor participation rates, male, female, everything. It's a very, very rich survey. Yeah. I mean, there is no issue on that one. Just want to say before the next panel comes here that our best papers are still to come tomorrow. So all of you, please do come back.
Just quickly to clarify, I mean, I think it's an NSSO that actually releases these numbers, right? The National, Sample Survey Office, not really the government quota. I mean, though it's a government agency. Thank you so much to both. Let's have a wonderful round of applause for the presenter and the discussant.